Thank you, Barbara, and good morning, everyone. I wanted to begin this panel discussion today with a little bit of a confession. As Barbara said, my name's Adam Greenspan. I'm a partner at Peter Walker and Partners, and the only thing that I really care about is looks. I'm glad you laughed, because of course I'm kidding. As we heard all day yesterday, landscape architecture has been focused on much more than just decoration for at least 50 years since this declaration, if not since the inception of the profession. And that being said, when we listen to what we heard yesterday, there seems to be a deep-seated fear, or at least a warning, that if you acknowledge aesthetics or beauty directly, your work or the field will be marginalized. While we here all found ourselves engaged and provoked by the declarations that we heard yesterday, we also note that a notion of physical design and communication through the way that landscapes are experienced was conspicuously absent in most of those declarations. We share many of the concerns that were presented, but when thinking about a declaration for the future, it should be acknowledged that the physical, designed, and constructed landscapes that we create do engage nature, but they're actually cultural design projects. To this end, a central question has come up. Is aesthetic aspect of our work the most trivial, or, unstated as it is, could it be the most powerful? Could conscious design be the thing that sets landscape architecture apart from science or engineering? In our increasingly virtual world, can an explicit focus on an aesthetic agenda and material design have the potential to cut through a disengaged experience of the physical to shape people's perception? The panelists here today are each accomplished in their work that ranges from practice to theory to teaching. Each panelist agrees that aesthetics and physical design itself must be understood as a powerful component of landscape architecture, though I would say not the only thing, obviously. I'm looking forward to discussing the relationship between design aesthetics and the important topics that were brought up in the declarations yesterday. I'm joined today by Claude Cormier, Mikyoung Kim, Chris Reed, Maria Goula, and Ken Smith. Each has her or his own practice and has taught at institutions around the world. I was hoping to begin today's panel discussion by looking and talking to them about their general concepts of aesthetics through a window into each of their personal design or aesthetic approaches, and the basic question of whether you all think that there's a mandate for your work to have a visual or experiential strength. Thanks.
Thank you, Adam. So I guess to answer that question, I may explain it through a short story. That last semester, I was invited at Michael Van Valkenburg's studio at the GSD for a day-long seminar on creativity. And I had to demonstrate to the students the kind of a thinking process that we undertake at the office. And it was a one-day-long presentation. And each student had to write a paper afterwards. And there's this very cute student, Jen Carva. In her paper, she asks this beautiful joke in a way that describes very much of what we do. And she said, what do you get when Frederick La Olmsted and Martha Schwartz has a baby? The answer is a Cormier. So I guess my work is it's the marriage of the two. And we do urban projects, and we're very much interested in the work for people who live in the city. And nowadays, people in the city are very educated. They know what they want, and they are very involved in the thing. So when I was a student at Harvard, I did study Olmsted quite a bit. And I was very interested by the fact he was a journalist. And I realized that his landscape were actually total artificial construction. That was an image of the idolized nature with a clear social intention to cure the industrial city and to bring the experience of nature for the city dweller. He traveled to Europe. He borrowed that language from the private, the rich, with the picturesque landscape, and brought it in America for the public. So, and then within this notion of experience that was very much embedded in his work. And also this notion of experience nature for the general public, just to experience, to see it. And from within this, There's a kind of a natural beauty that comes, and this is what's called the aesthetical experience. So that's one thing in the kind of relationship with nature. And in the 80s, as a counterpart, Martha Schwartz came along with her background in visual arts. And this is when I was a student then at University of Toronto. And she used culture, visual art, in a way of constructing landscape. And I guess she was not really aware of the impact that she would have. But by doing this, she was doing exactly the same thing as Olmsted, but she was constructing landscape with a whole total different reference. And she has freed me, I think, early on, to think differently and to use culture in a way of making it something that you experience. The kind of an aesthetics that it's not referencing always nature. So the two of them are the ones that have been influencing my career, because before going to landscape, I was actually heading to do genetics, and I wanted to do plant breeding. So instead of crossing different type of plants, I realized that I'm crossing ideas from different time, different genre, and reinventing landscape, and kind of a new aesthetics can come from that. So that's...
Thank you. Mikyoung?
Can we clap? Well, I really appreciated all the declarations that we heard yesterday. I think it was a great reminder of the global pressing issues that we as landscape architects have to address. They were ecological, cultural, geopolitical. And I think that the other thing that we saw yesterday was a lot of beautiful data, kind of graphically represented. So I just wanted to start off by saying how much I appreciated all of that information. But what we're here to do today is to talk about aesthetics. And, you know, aesthetics is a difficult word. I think that when we talk about this thing that I think is a very important component of design, but we don't have very good language to describe it. So yesterday I heard a number of speakers, or a few of them, kind of touch on it tangentially. So there's beauty, identity, and maybe culture. You know, all those issues, I think, they skirt around. I think that what we're talking about is something that when we see it, we know it, right? And so what I think is that maybe we're talking more about the process. And maybe it's creativity rather than aesthetics. I don't know. But yesterday when we saw all these kind of analytical, scientifically based diagrams, I think that, you know, that is so beautiful to us because it is methodical, it is conscious, it's backed by scientific data. Whereas the creative process of thinking relies on intuition. And I think that I think we know that intuition comes from our subconscious. So it's like two very different things as landscape architects we have to weigh. And I would argue that analytics on its own is not enough to create great design. I think that you need both the conscious and the subconscious, that we need to use both hemispheres of our brain to create great work. And I think that the reason why they're so different is that the conscious and the analytical is often a very methodical and sequential process, whereas the creative side of us, that intuitive side, it can move, that thought process can move in kind of leaps of discovery. And so they appear to be leaps, although we don't know much about it. And both are very important. So in the end, I think that design is a kind of amalgam of that creative and the analytical. And yesterday we saw from Carl Steinitz, and I had Carl Steinitz as a teacher, so I remember the kind of categories that he liked to create, which is I think it was like regional, and then at the bottom was the garden, and we were asked to kind of select one or the other. And I would argue that today's practitioners actually don't kind of pigeonhole themselves so clearly into one or the other, but that we live in a strata somewhere between the two. My practice personally doesn't necessarily handle the regional, but we do handle kind of larger urban settings down to kind of, we design tableware for Swarovski's crystals, so there's a wide range. And that it is our obligation as landscape architects to weigh and balance the kind of creative and the analytical. We need both. And as we kind of traverse through these various scales, we need to be nuanced and complex in our thinking about how we balance what's more important, and that they're not equal at all times. And so, I think that if we veer too wildly to one side, that we are just these kind of analytical beings, we fall in love with this kind of data-based design, then we fall into the danger of creating designs that maybe lack kind of that kind of character, that the uniqueness that we as individual creative beings bring to the profession. And then I think if we veer too wildly to the other side and we kind of wallow in into the subconscious and the intuitive, then I think we create work where we ignore all of the pressing matters that we heard about yesterday. So I really believe that landscape architecture is both the art and the science of design. And we need to, in the declaration, the McCarthyan Declaration, add that and emphasize both the kind of both hemispheres of our brain.
For me, I think for all of us, this has been a pretty difficult topic to start to talk about, to contend, to wrestle with ourselves. Aesthetics, as you know, isn't just about the physical or the visual. It's about the experiential, and it goes deep into philosophy. And so on a Saturday morning at 9 a.m., it's a pretty heavy topic, especially after a few too many glasses of wine last night. But after reading some of the declarations and then hearing them again yesterday, I think it's a topic that's made more essential and needs to be more at the center of what we do and what we talk about. You could have come out of yesterday's session thinking our first role was to save the earth or to save society. And while I'm absolutely an advocate that landscape can do many things, that we can take on ecological, environmental, social, political, economic agendas, I think we need to lead with design first. I think as a design profession, we have an obligation to push a very strong and central cultural agenda. And so for me, the issues that were put on the table yesterday are incredibly important and pressing, but we need to address them through design, through the qualitative, through the experiential, and do it in very contemporary ways. For us, I took on the challenge of trying to figure out what is it that we value at the firm in terms of the visual, the experiential, the aesthetic, because it's obviously there. There's not a singular approach or answer to the question. I think the projects vary quite widely. But in some of these, you can see an aesthetic of, say, smoothness or plasticity or variation, facilitated by some of the tools and techniques and technologies that we have at our disposal now. I think there's an aesthetic of hybridity, sometimes of extraordinary juxtapositions, say, or combinations of materials or textures. I think there's an aesthetic of the commonplace and the mass-produced, of the pragmatic, of the functional, sometimes even of an aesthetic of code and regulation. More broadly for us, there's an aesthetic of performance, of changeability, of ephemerality, trying to design in these, or allow for, sometimes exquisite, sometimes dramatic moments where things emerge and then they fade out again. I think there's an interest in the aesthetics of intensities and atmosphere and multisensorial experience. And most importantly, I think there's an aesthetic of physical interaction and engagement. Simply the experiences of being in the world and feeling alive. At the end of the day, I think, in order to get at some of the issues that we heard about yesterday, we really need to do it by moving people's hearts, by triggering their imagination, and by stimulating their minds. And so for me, I think, the task at hand is to aspire to what Beth was calling a good life for all, that absolutely takes in the environmental and social, but really puts the qualitative as an equal player among those.
Good morning, everybody. Difficult to add more specificity in this and the previous argumentation. So I will allow myself a kind of a counterpoint. I'll insist of, I think, the group's understanding of the theme as a provocation. And so I started thinking, shall we answer this question? Shall we, this question mark that we added that maybe has to become an exclamation mark? I started, trying to write down some thoughts and thinking about the physical reality, our physical world when everything has an imprint. And of course, this imprint has multiple and variable experiential dimensions. And I guess probably because we're not always as good in revealing this multiplicity and variability of the experience, we are here again talking about this issue. However, for me, the most provocative thing is the separation. Aesthetics, ecology, society. At a point I thought, is it an alphabetical order? No, it's not. And so I was really happy that aesthetics is the first in hierarchy, so we are good. And I'm in the group, so I thought that was amazing. So after 20 years, at least, since the time I studied, and I never, actually never stopped practicing and abandoning architecture and becoming or trying to become a landscape architect. We have been talking, and teaching and practicing, around this idea of the appearance of performance, no? And some of the beautiful titles that the speakers yesterday proposed were actually really playing, tweaking, retuning this idea, introducing different aspects of it. Mark Tribe said the words, both and. I feel I grew up with that phrase. So now we're talking about emergence, we're talking about natural culture. So every discipline, I think, especially creative discipline, needs this wording, to keep us in the right track. So is it then, do we acknowledge a risk with this need to talk in this declaration about aesthetics, to talk about design, because we are afraid that most of the, spatial words are mere arrangements. So, and then I ended up thinking, does it imply the need for new aesthetics? And I think Chris introduced the idea through his own prism. And I just remembered Maria Hellström, probably you know her, a wonderful colleague and teacher and theorist that through, with the pretext of the evident need to replace ourselves in the relationship with the environment, with the planet, with the earth. She talks about, the need for new ontology, and ontologies need new aesthetics. So I will use her wording, which talks about reordering. So I like this idea of reordering because I think it's in the core of design, and it has special systemic and processual implications. So the propositive part of this editing of mine is that I don't think that we simply need new aesthetics, but maybe we have to talk about multiple aesthetics. And I don't understand aesthetics as a kind of external cultural reference or a style or I don't know, a personal language. I'm very much interested, and those who know me, I think they will give credit to what I'm saying. I'm interested in the framing of aesthetics and understanding of aesthetics, as a disciplinary framework of values. So I'm not so much interested about individual aesthetics or personal. I'm more interested about the creation of a disciplinary framework of values. So I had the privilege to be part of the Landscape European and now International Biennial in Barcelona. And we still have a long way to go, but I think that these platforms that are constant help us to understand the pulse of the profession. And, we saw how representation changed. We kept drawing and drawing. We talked about the aesthetics of the ground. We talked about the aesthetics of, fluidity. We talked about, these aesthetics of low-cost activism, curational framings. But I will just propose two titles, and maybe we can talk more about those. I think we need the aesthetics of articulation, and I think also we have to create aesthetics of anticipation.
In the original declaration, it speaks to the historic art of landscape, and I'm wondering, why aren't we a living art, and why aren't we talking about contemporary aesthetics? And the declarations yesterday were all really interesting, dealing with climate change and urbanization and social equity, survival, and sort of at the end of it, I kind of was left with, what the fuck? How are we going to talk about aesthetics, right? I mean, do aesthetics matter? I mean, and clearly they do matter, and I believe that they matter. So if you'll bear with me, I have notes I'll follow. So I'd like to start with the question of what landscapes mean. I don't think you can consider the question of aesthetics without addressing issues of content, meaning, and intentionality. Aesthetics are the qualitative, we've all said qualitative this morning. Aesthetics are the qualitative aspects of design that allow a designed place, its spaces, program, and forms to speak and provide meaning to human users. It is that part of placemaking that provides moments of insight. It may delight, confound, enlighten, sadden, soothe, exhilarate. Aesthetics are the emotional core of what we do as landscape architects. And we've all spoken about the data and the qualitative stuff today, and clearly we increasingly live in a data-driven culture with an emphasis on the quantitative metrics, the prescriptive models, minimum standards, and best practices for almost all aspects of landscape performance, often to the exclusion of the qualitative concerns. Through digital means, it's easy to appropriate precedents, adapt models, apply parametric algorithms to generate workable design solutions. So rhetorically speaking, with the prospect of artificial intelligence, one might ask, why do we even need designers and aesthetics? I mean, what's the point? Can't we program that? Can't we simply model the quantitative metrics to solve the problems? And isn't fabrication simply the application of design standards and specifications? I think too often this is what actually constitutes standard practice. And I'd like to raise the question of what about exceptional design practice? Shouldn't that be our ideal? Shouldn't we do more than standard? So I believe that intentionality is what gives our work meaning and direction. Strategic ideas expressed with conceptual clarity and rigor of design execution is at the core of our craft. And we do have a craft. This is what constitutes landscape as an art form. Good design isn't something that's applied after the fact. It's not done after you've solved the problems. It isn't a question of styling. One's aesthetics, their philosophical position, their interpretation of the program, their working methodology, along with questions of structure, proportion, materiality, process, and fabrication, are critical to our craft and fundamental to our art. Aesthetics lie at the heart of our professional mandate. It is how and why we create meaningful places that matter to people and matter over time. I think one only has to think about the contemplative dry garden of Ryoanji, for example, or the sublime long meadow at Prospect Park, or the reframing of the old industrial spaces in memory at Landschaftspark Duis Nord, to understand that aesthetics matter greatly and are central to our work as landscape architects. So I'll return to the question of what landscapes mean and why aesthetics matter. Aesthetics express the qualitative aspects of design. Aesthetics and aesthetic practice are the language, the emotional core of our designs. It's how we communicate. It is essential to our profession's new declaration, I believe, and it should be forefront design and aesthetics as a central and ongoing concern for our profession. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. I think it was said yesterday that an obsession with form or with aesthetics marginalizes what we do. When we did see a line through many of the declarations focused on the environmental or the social goals and sort of achievements that landscape architecture is working towards. And I guess, obviously, the formal or the physical matters to all of you. So I guess the question is, do you think you need to be obsessed with that to a degree as a practitioner to bring these projects into the world as physical things? Because what I was hearing yesterday was a sort of assumption that design will work out as long as we focus on the issues. But do you think that design works out, or do you think that this is something you need to work for and towards? Claude?
Well, I think the design is the element, the way everything gel. And I think that the issues are extremely complex, but this is where there's a kind of an intuitive element that comes into place, that you align everything together. And that whole journey of the project is actually trying to keep all those things streamlined, because at the end, when you do the act of design, you commit, right? And this commitment is expressed through form. It expressed to a kind of, and that form takes time to get realized. And then you have to have a very clear intention higher than all of those issues. Because if you just worry about the issues, in a sense, you're going to sink with them. So I think design is a way that helps you to start floating in.
That's right. I mean, design is not like Euclidean geometry, let's say, that, you know, there's this perfect answer that yields a perfect shape. And I think a couple people have talked about what is a contemporary aesthetic, but I think it does require for us as designers to kind of nurture both ways of thinking, you know, because the creative side is as difficult, if not more difficult, than the analytic side, that we all have a unique voice. And I think this is not just for practitioners, but it's for academia, that we need to train our young people to really understand that that's just as important and that they need to start working on that right away when they're in school. But the question that was brought up is like, what is the contemporary aesthetic? And I think I don't really have an answer to it. I am not a philosopher. But I do know that every time I say the word aesthetic, like a little part of me dies inside because there's just something about it that really bothers me. And I think it's that, as you were talking, Chris, I was thinking, you know, we live in the 21st century, and the word aesthetics, if I hearken back to my years in college and maybe to my classes with Beth Meyer, who I apologize to now before I say anything about this, but I think, you know, it's what, 350 BC with Aristotle and Plato, who kind of outlined these kind of ideal notions of symmetry and beauty. And I think that today Gina talked about this yesterday, we live in a different world. We live in a very diverse world. In the US, the population's getting more and more diverse. We know that the academic world and the student body is getting more and more diverse. And that should tell us something about how our aesthetics should be addressed. That's different from, I heard a number of people yesterday talk about how the McCargian photographs were, 4 or 5 white men. And we now live in a world where it's much more diverse. And should our aesthetics not now start to reflect the kind of people who we're designing for and the people who we are as designers?
I think, you know, artists and architects don't have a problem talking about issues of aesthetic and form and physicality, right? And I think as a discipline, we have, most recently. Last couple decades, the discipline has made amazing strides in recovering a kind of central and more complex role for what we can do in cities and society, nation building even. But there's still this resistance to just engaging at the level of design, experimentation, aesthetic values, aesthetic qualities. And I think we suffer because of that. I think right now architects still hold more cultural capital than we do. You see that in the widespread coverage of events in Venice at the Biennale, you know, opening of a Serpentine pavilion, the fact that Frank Gehry was awarded the LA River. I mean, come on, right? Where's that coming from? It's coming from his status. But it's coming from his status, the cultural capital he holds as a designer. Not from somebody who really knows what's going on there. So I challenge us to say, look, we've got to take on these issues. We've got to have these debates. We've got to put them front and center. We need to be more experimental. We need to be more out front. And hopefully we can raise our own cultural capital to start to equal the kind of environmental and social ethic and initiatives that we can put on the table as well.
So what you're saying then is that with everything we've heard yesterday and the life that we're living, the TV that we're watching or the radio that we're listening to, the place of the landscape architect and the sensitivities that we have to the cultural and environmental processes puts us in a place to understand these things, but that the cultural capital that architects have, for example, is because of what they make. I mean, I think, and what they've made.
That's right. So it has to start with us as creative individuals. You think about Frank Gehry, you close your eyes and you can see an image. Now, we don't make kind of objects, so maybe it's harder for us to understand. But I guess I don't want to hog this, but
30 more seconds, and then we switch to these
30
questions.
seconds. I think that things are changing. I mean, I would say over the last 6-7 years, the clients, they do get it. You know, the clients that we have, they understand that landscape has the capacity to really create identity and to create places of gathering and to create success in the city. So I think they are changing, but it is really important in the declarations that we put forward that the things that Chris mentioned are included in that.
So I think we've answered the first question from the audience, so we're ahead. I think the second question is asking why there's 4 out of 5 people from the GSD here. but I think it's fewer than that.
I did not attend the GSD.
Yeah, so
I'm a Penn grad.
nor did
I
I.
didn't teach at the GSD.
But I think Richard Weller was leading the day and the organization of it. So I think we're a sort of scholastic group here. The next question is asking, can you speak to class and cultural hegemony in relation to aesthetics? When do aesthetic decisions in a time of globalization become a kind of colonialism?
I'll jump in. It strikes me that a lot of, we're talking about contemporary issues, contemporary environmental issues, contemporary social issues, and a lot of time we're actually trying to solve them with old aesthetics. And if you look at the art world and you look at what's happening around the world, I mean, the art world is all over the place. It doesn't speak with a single voice at all. It's multiple voice, it's all sorts of expressions, and it's experimental. And it seems to me that we should be just like the art world in terms of all that panoply of aesthetics in solving these contemporary problems. We need to be developing contemporary aesthetic solutions to the contemporary problems. The thing about Frank Gehry and Tom Main is that they took great risk in developing new aesthetic solutions for their buildings to deal with contemporary problems, scale of buildings and different programs. And I don't think we're doing that in our profession.
I think that was something that I've been thinking about lately, is that there are components of a building. There's a roof, there's a wall, there's a curtain wall, and these are the elements that these designers worked with, and other designers have worked with them with ecological goals. And I think there are elements from mapping, from hydrological studies, there are parts and components of landscape that we need, and I think designers have a role in that, and how those look, and developing aesthetics related to those elements are things that can shape society. We missed one, the top one.
There's partly in response to that question, there's also this question about how aesthetics can be considered, but who is determining this aesthetic? And I think in both those, there's a fear that it's highly individualistic and imposed on the community or the place that we're working with. And I might argue that actually, through real deep engagement in the work with the people that a project will affect, there are ways to kind of overcome this pure individual application of our own values onto another place. And I think there are great examples of people who do that. I think we all do that. We put ourselves in the environment, in discussions with people who are living everyday lives in these places. And through those discussions, through that engagement, we're able to find solutions that do have deep meaning and value to those people and communities.
That's right. And I would say, as practitioners, most of us have a global practice. We do work all around the world, and it is our obligation to not just bring a kind of Western aesthetic when we're working in Eastern Asia or in the Middle East, so that we have to be more open and we have to be more collaborative.
I was just wanted to be a little bit provocative. I think good practice has always been very collaborative. I don't imagine all the projects that we ever admired that were, but I think there was a kind of an old paradigm that we were thinking, that we had to, just venerate or exaggerate, the genius and the talent, of the artistic figure that was, leading all this process. I think we have, moved into very different horizontal processes. And I don't know. I mean, it's about negotiation and constant dialogue, and lots of frustration, of course, and lots of energy, and But I don't think that anyone, imagines working in this kind of perfect world of having aesthetic, creative, production on his own.
Oftentimes when I go to the art galleries a lot, oftentimes when I see something new it's ugly actually. And I look at it and go, I don't get it. What's it about? And that's actually, it's aesthetic. It makes you think and try to figure out what it's saying. It's got a point of view that may not be what we want to hear. It may not be beautiful, but that is aesthetic.
And that's, I mean, the most popular question right now, or the second, is asking if we have a responsibility to advocate for ugly landscapes. Landscapes of adaptation are often perceived as unattractive, mudflats, swamps, dark or unsafe places.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, I think that how do you integrate, and wouldn't it be the designer that can integrate all different kinds of experiences and impacts to people that use them?
There's a great Japanese garden. Is it Miyajima, where there's a mud flat and a torii gate at the end, and you actually have to walk out along the mud, and your shoes get all gooky, and if you stay out there too long, the tide comes in, you can't get back, and it's a most amazing experience. But it's kind of ugly, you know, but it works.
One other one that came up here is talking about the fact that landscape architects don't actually make landscapes, they draw them. And so the question of representation, could talking about representation offer a path toward understanding contemporary aesthetics?
It's incredibly important. I mean, Zaha Hadid built her reputation on her drawings, which were incredible, right? Exquisite explorations of form and space. And I think, you know, oftentimes we'll have people come to us, I've heard this story from others, saying, how do you find the time to put that much attention and energy into a drawing, you know, that you're not getting paid for? And my response is, well, we have to do the drawing in order to then do the work, to begin that creative process of exploration. So I think in some respects, particularly once you get into practice, the act of drawing, the creative act of drawing is highly undervalued, right? There's too much time spent just trying to get the work done. And it's I think, our first road in.
Right. I think the other aspect of this is that over the last 10 years, drawing has been redefined. We have all this incredible software and hardware that has transformed the kind of power of what our drawings can relay. But I think what I'm advocating for across the board with aesthetics and how we express it is that maybe we use a wider toolbox. And so maybe with drawing right now, I think there is a kind of a consistency in how we use certain softwares, that there might be kind of more old-fashioned tools that we can reintegrate. It's not to say that Photoshop and Rhino and all these things and Grasshopper are not important and powerful tools, but that there are other tools that allow for us to actually be more creative and create work that's more unique and have more character.
I think wrapping up with the audience questions, I would say that we've answered, and the one about ecology might be taken off. But I think that, you know, a mandate that we heard then, and I think the mandate for the designer would be to somehow address the issues, to engage ecology, and to make ecology part of what's communicated through the aesthetics. These aren't two separate things, but they should be overlapped. And I don't think we're here to say that they're separate right now.
That's right.
Thanks. So I think wrapping up our session here, when we think about what's happening over these 2 days and the idea of making a declaration for landscape architecture and landscape architects, what jumped out to each of us as each of us read the declarations or didn't read them and then listened to them, is that if you were putting together a declaration intended for professionals, students, and sort of seasoned professionals that might have been trained in another time but are practicing now, the question comes up, what should be in that declaration? And after, you know, sitting through an entire day, the oblique references towards form, towards design, towards aesthetics, or the embarrassed or negative references towards those things make it seem like it's something that shouldn't be talked about, or shouldn't be part of an official declaration. And this is just an angle that's saying this needs to somehow get into a declaration for the future, because we think it's something that's a really important part of what we do in the world. And I think that's sort of the way that I'd like to end this. Thank you.